First, in that innovation are added to an existing corpus rather than replacing redundant elements. It is cumulative. Second, in that this innovation must be basically consistent with what is already present. It is conservative. Third, in that these processes lead to the crystallization of specialist subgenres. It involves differentiation. Tudor himself is cautious about adopting the biological analogy of evolution, with its implication that only those genres which are well adapted to their function survive. Christianly, Gledhill also notes the danger of essentialism in selecting definitive classic examples toward which early examples evolve and after which other decline. The cycles and transformations of genres can nevertheless be seen as a response to political, social, and economic conditions. Referring to films, Andrew Tudor notes that a genre defines a moral and social world. Tudor in 74. Indeed, a genre in any medium can be seen as embodying certain values and ideological assumptions. Again, in the context of the cinema, Susan Hayward argued that genre conventions change according to the ideological climate of the time, contrasting John Wayne westerns with Clint Eastwood as the problematic hero anti-hero. Hayward in 96. Leo Baldry cited Hayward in 96 sees film genres as a barometer of the social and cultural concerns of cinema audience. Robert Leisher illustrates how televisual genres reflect the values of the program makers. Some commentators see mass media genres from a particular era as reflecting values which were dominant at the time. Ida Konigsberg, for instance, suggests that texts within genres embody the moral values of a culture, and John Fiske asserts that genetics conversations embody the crucial ideological concern of the time in which they are popular. In Fiske 87, however, Steve Nail stresses that genres may also help to shape such values. Thwaites et al. See the relationship as reciprocal. A genre develops according to social conditions. Transformations in genre and text can influence and reinforce social conditions. Some Marxist commentators see genre as an instrument of social control which reproduces the dominant ideology. Within the perspective, the genre positions the audience in order to naturalize the ideologies which are embedded in the texts. Fewer in 92. Bernadette Cassay comments that certainly recently structuralism and feminist theories, among others, have focused on the way in which generically defined structures may operate to construct particular ideologies and values, and to encourage reasoning and conservative interpretations of a given text. Cassay, however, reader-oriented commentators have stressed that people are capable of reading against the grain. Thomas and Vivian Sockback note that in the past popular filmmakers intend to telling a story A story were not always aware of the converse psychological and social subtexts of their own films would add that modern filmmakers in their audience are now more keenly aware of the myth-making accomplished by film genres. Genre can reflect a function within the relation to television, or as Newcomb and Paul Hirsch referred to as a cultural forum in which industry and audience negotiate shared beliefs and values, helping to maintaining the social order and assisting it in adapting to change. Certainly, genres are far from being ideological neutrals. Sonia Livingstone argues indeed that different genres are concerned to establish different worldviews. In 90. Related to ideological dimensions of genres is one modern definition in terms of purpose. In relation to writing, Caroline Miller argues that a rhetorically sound definition of genre must be countered not on the substance or form of discourse but on the action it is used to accomplish. Caroline Miller, 84. Following this lead, John Wells declares that the principal criterion feature that turns a collection of communicative events into a genre is some shared of the communicative purposes. In relation to the mass media, it can be fruitful to consider in relation to genre the purpose not only of the producers of texts but also of those who interpret them, which needs not be assumed always to match a consensus about the primary purposes of some genres, such as new bulletins, and of their readers. Is probably easier to establish that in relation to others, such as westerns, where the very term purpose sounds too instrumental. However, uses and gratifications, researchers have already conducted investigations into the various functions that the mass media seem to serve for people, and the ethnographic studies have offered fruitful insights into this dimension. Miller argues that both in writing and reading within genres, we learn purposes appropriate to the genre. In relation to the mass media, it could be argued that particular genres develop, frame and legitimate particular concerns, questions and pleasures. Related definitions of genre focus more broadly on the relationship between the makers and audience of text, a rhetorical dimension, to varying extent that the formal features of genre establish the relationship between producers and interpreters. Indeed, in relation to mass media text, Andrew Tolson redefines genre as a category which mediates between industry and audience. Towson, 96. Note that such approaches undermine the definition of genre as purely textual types, which includes any reference even to intended audience. A basic model underlying contemporary media theory is a triangular relation between the text, its producers, and its interpreters. From the perspective of many recent commentators, genres first and foremost provide frameworks within which texts are produced and interpreted. Semiotically, a genre can be seen as a shared code between the producers and interpreters of text included within it, and therefore goes so far as to suggest that communication is impossible without the agreed codes of genre. Within genres, texts embody authorial attempts to position readers using particular modes of address. Gunter Kress observes that every genre positions those of who participate in a text of that kind as interviewer or interviewee, as listener or storyteller, as a reader or writer, as a person interested in political matters, as someone to be instructed, or as someone who instructs. Each of these positions implies different possibilities for the response and for action. Each written text provides a reading position for readers and a position constructed by the writer to the ideal reader of the text. Thus, embedded within text are assumptions about the ideal reader, including their attitudes toward the subject matter and often their class, age, gender, and ethnicity. Gunter Kress defines a genre as a kind of text that derives its forms from the structure of a frequently repeated social occasion with its characteristics, participants, and their purpose. In 88, an interpretative emphasis of genders on gender and opposite to the individual text can help to remind us of a social nature of the production and interpretation of text. In relation to film, many modern commentators refer to the commercial and industrial significance of genres. Dennis McQuaid argues that the genre may be considered as a practical device for helping any mass medium to produce consistently and efficiently, and to relate his production to the expectation of its customers. Since it is also a practical device for enabling individual media users to plan their choices, it can be considered as a mechanism for ordering the relations between the two main parties to mass communication. Steve Neal observed that genres exist within the context of a set of economic relations and practices. Thought the adds that genres are not the product of economic factors as such. The conditions provided by the capitalism economy account neither for the existence of the particular genres that have hitherto been produced, nor for the existence of the conventions that constitute them. Economic factors may account for the perpetuation of profitable genres. Nicholas Abercrombie notes that television producers set out to exploit genre conventions. It makes sound economic sense. Sets, properties, and customers can be used over and over again. Teams and stars, writers, directors, and technicians can be built up, giving economies of scale. Abercrombie 96. He adds that genres permit the creation and maintenance of a loyal audience, which becomes used to seeing programs within a genre. Genre can be seen as a means of controlling demand. The relative stability of genres enabled producers to predict audience expectations. Christine Gledhill notes that differences between genres means different audiences could be identified as an character too. This made it easier to standardize and establish production. In relation to the mass media, genre is part of the process of targeting different market sectors. Traditionally, literary and film critics in particular have regarded generic texts, by which they mean formulaic texts, as inferior to those which they contend are produced outside a generic framework. Indeed, film theorists frequently refer to popular films as genre films in contrast to non-formal films. Elitist critics reject the generic fiction of the mass media because they are commercial products of popular culture rather than high art. Many harbor the romantic ideology of the primacy of authorial originality and vision, emphasizing individual style and artistic self-expression. In this tradition, the artist in any medium is seen as breaking the mold of convention. For the Italian aesthetician Benedetto Croce, an artistic work has always unique, and there could be no artistic genres. More recently, some literacy and film theories have accorded more importance to genre, counteracting the ideology of authorial primacy of authorism, as it is known, in relation to the emphasis on the director in film. Contemporary theorists tend to emphasize the importance of the semiotic notion of intertextuality, of seeing individual texts in relation to others. Katie Wales notes that genre is an intertextual concept. John Hartley suggests that we need to understand genre as a property of the relations between texts. And as Tony Twites put it, each text is influenced by the generic rules in the way it is put together. The generic rules are reinforced by each text. Roland Barthes argued that it is in relation to other texts within a genre rather than in relation to lived experience that we make sense of certain events within a text. There are analogies here with schema theory in psychology, which propose that we have mental scripts which help us to interpret familiar events in everyday life. John Fiske offers this striking example. A representation of a car chase only makes sense in relation to all others we have seen. After all, we are unlikely to have experienced one in reality, and if we did, we would, according to this model, make sense of it by turning into another text, which we will also understand intertextually in terms of what we have seen so often on our screens. There is then a cultural knowledge of the concept car chase that any text is prospectus for, and that is used by the viewers to code it and by the producer to encode it. Fiske 18:7. In contrast to those of traditionalists, literary Ben who tend to present artistic tests and non-generic, it could be argued that it is impossible to produce texts which bear, bear no relationship whatsoever to establish a genres. Indeed, Jacques Derrida proposes that a text cannot belong to no genre. Can it cannot be without a genre. Every text participates in one or several genres. There is no genreless text. Derrida. Working within genres. John Hartley argues that genres are agents of ideological closure. They limit the meaning potential of a given text. Robert Oge and Gunther Kress define genres as typical forms of text which link kind of producers, consumer, topic, medium, manager, and occasion, adding that they control the behavior of producers of such texts and the expectation of potential consumers. Genres can be seen as constituting a kind of tacit contract between authors and readers. From the traditional romantic perspective, genres are seen as contrasting and inhabilitating authorial creativity. However, contemporary theories, even within literary studies, typically reject this view. Gledhill notes that one perspective of this issue is that some of those who write within a genre work in creative tension with the conversation, attempting a personal inflection of them. From the point of view of the producer of text within a genre, an adventure of genres is that they can rely on readers already having knowledge and expectations about work within a genre. Fowler comments that the system of generic expectations amounts to a code by the use of which or by the departure from which compositions becomes more economical. Genres can thus be seen as a kind of shorthand serving to increase the efficiency of communication. They may even function as a means of preventing a text from dissolving into individualism and incomprehensibility. And while writing within a genre involves making use of certain given conventions, every work within a genre also involves the invention of some new elements. As for reading within genres, some argue that knowledge of genre conventions leads to passive consumption of generic texts, or they argue that making sense of text within genres is an active process of construction meaning. Genre provides an important frame of reference which helps readers to identify, select, and interpret the text. Indeed, in relation to advertisements, Varda Lagos-Laymore argues that the sense which viewers make of any single text depends on how it relates to the genre as a whole. The psychological functions of genre is likely to include those those shared by categorization generally, such as reducing complexity. Generic frameworks may function to make form the conventions of the genre more transparent to those familiar with the genre, foregrounding the distinctive content of individual texts. Genre theorists may find much in common with schema theories in psychology, so much as a genre in a framework within which to make sense of related texts. A schema is a kind of mental template within which to make sense of related experiences in everyday life. From the point of view of schema theory, genres are textual schemata. Any text requires what is sometimes called cultural capital on the part of its audience to make sense of it. Generic knowledge is one of the competencies required. Like most of our everyday knowledge, generic knowledge is typically tacit and will be difficult for most readers to articulate as any kind of detailed and current framework. Clearly, one needs to encounter sufficient examples of a genre in order to recognize shared features as being characteristic of it. Alistair Fowler suggests that readers learn genres gradually, usually through unconscious familiarization. There are a few examples of empirical investigation of how people acquire or use genre in interpretative frameworks in everyday life. However, a few of these studies have been conducted with children in relation to television genres. In an intensive longitudinal study of 12 children from 2 to 5 years old, Leona Glagom and Woger Gardner noted the development of gender distinctions. 2 years olds did not recognize the beginnings and endings of programs. The researchers found that for the 2 years olds, the disappearance of characters was a source of consternation. Children become very upset and sometimes even cry when their favorite television personalities leave the screen. They suggested that this feature might assist the eventual identification of the advertisement genre. The researchers report the order of the acquisition of the principal genre distinction. Advertisement, cartoons, early in interval, Sesame Street, news, children's shows, late interval adult shows. They argue that in the first few years of attempting to sort out the confusing elements of the television world, children are concentrated into making distinctions between shows.